Hello and welcome to session 21. This is the session dealing with the New Romantics, post-punk, gothic rock, and synth pop. One of the main themes for this particular class, we'll be talking about music and depression. There are several studies, a multitude really, of studies of the relationship, concerning the relationship between depression and music. And as you'll see with the small sampling I'm about to give you, they often contradict each other. A 2013 study by Sandra Garrido and Emery Schubert, published in Musica Scientia, found that clinically depressed people listening to sad music led to rumination, that it caused them to ruminate. And they are using this in a rather technical sense. What they mean is that it causes people to dwell on what was making them depressed or sad in the first place, and therefore they get stuck in these negative cycles of thought. And this was occurring instead of what they had thought would occur based on sort of aesthetic prejudice, if nothing else, would be catharsis, the purging of negative emotion. But a 2019 study published in Emotion, the journal Emotion, by John Rottenberg and Soo-Kyung Yoon and others, demonstrated that listening to music made sad people less sad, owing to the calming effect generally associated with sad music. On the one hand, such studies seem to cancel each other out, as we've just said. On the other hand, they may be speaking past each other. Do Garrido and Schubert use depressed in a manner comparable to what Rottenberg and Jung mean by sad? Or are they really looking at totally different issues? While everyone recognizes that the use of music is or recognizes the use of music as a mood regulator, no one has yet produced a completely plausible reason as to why we might turn to depressing music and art when we ourselves are depressed, or for that matter, why we might turn to it at all. Why do we want to hear depressing things? This goes back at least to ancient Greece. Aristotle pondered why it was that we wanted to look at or might be pleased by paintings of corpses, when if we saw an actual corpse, we would recoil in horror. So there's obviously something different between our experience in real life and our experience of art. And somehow our experience of art removes us from real life so that we can enjoy things on an aesthetic level that we would not enjoy in reality. And perhaps the relationship between music and depression is similar to this. Let's look at some other possibilities. So there are several proposed explanations concerning the relationship between music and depression and why we might listen to depressing music when we are depressed. One is the notion of catharsis. That goes back to Aristotle, the idea that listening to sad music will purge us of our sadness. The next one might be what we call an aesthetic argument, right? We might say that sad music tends to be thought of as being more serious and thus more engaging as art. And therefore, the art is deep and distracts us from the everyday. So we tend to, this is a common prejudice, we tend to think that happy music is somehow less serious than sad or moving, deeply moving music. Think of the song, for instance, "Happy," right? That was a fad for a while, and the commercials and so on that were related to that song. There was a sense of frivolity associated with it. So perhaps we listen to sad music because we think of it as more serious and therefore more distracting from the everyday. A third explanation, a very popular one these days, is the hormonal explanation. Music, we know, releases dopamine, which makes us happy, and that applies to sad music as well as happy music. But sad music seems to release a hormone called prolactin. This is somewhat controversial. People disagree as to whether or not the amount of prolactin released is significant. But what prolactin does is it prepares us for trauma, and it helps us to curb grief. So perhaps listening to sad music helps us deal with trauma and grief. Another theory is that we're dealing with social downward comparison. So I might be suffering, but if the singer of the song seems to be suffering more, even though it's a sort of fake suffering, I feel relatively okay. At least I don't have it that bad. Number five is the notion of mood in an almost philosophical sense. What moods do is they attune us to the world. Think about it. When you wake up in a bad mood, things look different to you than when you wake up in a good mood. right? Things, for instance, if you ever, and it doesn't happen that often, at least for me, but if you ever wake up in an inexplicably good mood and something rotten happens, you kind of roll with it. You can take it. It's okay. Whereas if the same thing happened on a day when you were in just a medium mood, it might wreck you or it might ruin things for you. So mood is a way in which the world shows up to us. And perhaps music, it is often believed that music contributes to mood, that it helps attune us to the way that the world appears. The final, and I think probably the best explanation, is the as if structure of art. That art is by definition not real. It is, after all, artificial, and yet seems to have some kind of relationship to truth. So when we're dealing with art, we take a step back from reality so we can see how sadness works or how misery works. And this gives us a different sense of our place in the world and this place of sadness in the world, and we become an observer rather than a sufferer. So these are all ways in which depression and music might relate. Now, the reason we're on about this is because the types of music that we're going to look at today, post-punk music, not all of it, but especially gothic rock and uh, the New Romantics and so on, they tend to deal with rather depressing subjects. So this is going to be, not all the songs we're going to look at today are depressing, but several of them will be. So post-punk music is a very broad label, like some of our other genre labels. It encompasses a wide variety of groups that sought to maintain elements of the do-it-yourself approach of punk music while drawing on synthesizers and other characteristic traits of dance music, dub, funk, and disco particularly. All of this is combined with a sort of avant-garde, quasi-experimental aesthetic. So the point for many of these bands was to move away from rock cliches, including punk cliches. So some of the typical things that you see in punk, they're going to try to move away from this. And they're also going to try to avoid certain pop cliches. So this is music that is in distinction to the things we were talking about last time, Madonna and Michael Jackson, although they might draw on certain elements of that, as we'll see. There's obviously some overlap here with new wave music, and there are many subgenres or related genres to the larger phenomenon of post-punk, including gothic rock, which we'll talk about, no wave, which we've already talked about and talked a little bit about again, industrial music, which we'll talk about today, and neo-psychedelia, which we'll deal with at a later time. Some of these groups are very politically oriented, and their lyrics drew on leftist and Marxist concerns and critical theory. Some of them are more philosophically oriented, so they're interested in modernist art, modernist film, existentialism, so Sartre and Camus and so on. And a lot of them are drawing on negative emotions and exploring negative emotions in the same way that existentialism as a philosophy does. Here we have one of the key bands of this style. This is Susie and the Banshees. Two things that you might look at from them that are classic gothic rock would be the Scream album from 1978, and then the song Spellbound from 1981, which we'll listen to a little bit now. And you can see the lyrics there. From the cradle bars comes a beckoning voice. It sends you spinning. You have no choice. And you'll see and hear over and over again that term, you have no choice, returns. Let's hear a bit of it. Notice the descending bass progression is very typical of this music. The descending motion tends to portray gloom more than happiness. Notice the moody use of percussion here. So notice the return of that line over and over again. You have no choice, but also you have that descending line. You have the atmospheric use of percussion at first before the drums actually kick in. When they do kick in, you hear the relationship to punk music quite obviously, although the progression is not necessarily the most typical of punk music. It's not unheard of. Here's one of the great bands of the British scene at this time. This is the Smiths with Morrissey on vocals and Johnny Marr on guitar. They formed in Manchester in 1982 and produced a series of really wonderful albums and really wonderful songs. And here's one called Heaven Knows I'm Miserable Now. So you can see once again the relationship to depression. But notice that the chord progression here is very jazzy. It's basically a 1-6-2-5 progression. It actually is a 1-6-2-4-5. So the 2 and the 4 split the predominant role there. And you'll hear a lot of major sevenths and minor seventh chords, so there's a jazzy element to it. And there's a contrast, a kind of irony between the happy sounding, major sounding, it's in E major, sounding aspect of the chords and the progression and even the melody, and then to hear his delivery and to hear the words that he's saying. And let's hear a bit of this. So this jazzy opening. 4, 5, and then we get to the 1. I was looking for a job and then I found a job, and heaven knows I'm miserable now in my life. Why do I give valuable time to people who don't care if I Notice if you just listen to the music, you might be fooled into thinking that this is supposed to be a very happy song. But this is a fellow who's obviously mired in misery, who can't seem to pull himself out of it. He looks for a job and he finds a job, but he's still miserable. Two lovers entwined sounds like a wonderful thing, but they're passing him by, and he's miserable now. So this is all leading toward Gothic rock. I would say that Susie and the Banshees, at least in the song that we heard, that's an example of Gothic rock. The Smiths, not so much Gothic rock, just the broader post-punk movement in Britain. But Gothic rock, more specifically, groups like Bauhaus, the early part of The Cure, and so on, they're drawing on the larger Gothic culture. In 1976, the novel Interview with a Vampire was published by Anne Rice, which provides a very romantic vision of a vampire tortured by the impossibility of love. It was very popular and it launched a renewed interest in the doomed but attractive image of the vampire. Certain post-punk bands, especially British and then later American, found inspiration in the proto-Gothic approaches of bands like The Doors or Velvet Underground in certain phases of David Bowie's career. The main bands that we're concerned with here, The Cure, Susie and the Banshees, Joy Division, and Bauhaus. The characteristics are a darker sound, heavy on the reverb, and we heard that in both of the examples we've already heard, even though, again, the Smiths aren't exactly Gothic rock, but still heavy reverb. Often with a high register bass line that defies the traditional function. You'll hear that clearly with The Cure. Hypnotic beats, lots of tom-toms in the drums, almost avoiding the cymbals, so there's a kind of quasi-tribal effect here. A drone-like approach to the singing, and then sometimes even actual drones in the music, just held tones. These dirge-like tempos, dramatic and melancholic melodies and lyrics, and then themes familiar with from Gothic literature, existentialism, nihilism, the denial of any values, dark romanticism, melancholy, the idealization of death. Often some of these songs are even about suicide, for instance. Um, we have various styles, fashion styles that are associated with this. So dark, elaborate, draping clothing, heavy makeup, particularly black mascara is familiar from like The Cure and so on. Here we see a good example of that look, and you can see that the main singer of Bauhaus here is dressed up more or less like a vampire, right? In all black and the kind of strange, exaggerated widow's peak in the hair and the slick down aspect. And you can see that Bauhaus, like a lot of bands that we'll talk about in the 80s and 90s, have their own little symbol. That's what's all the way over to the left. In the middle is the album cover for the single, Bela Lugosi's Dead. Of course, Bela Lugosi is a famous. A lot of his movies were B movies, but he also did some major films, but horror films. So he's the most famous screen depiction of Dracula in the early days of film, both the silent films and the early days of sound film. Um, and he died in the 70s, and so this is a song dedicated to him. Bauhaus initially meant the song to be something of a kind of a joke, not exactly, but it wound up becoming very successful. And Bauhaus was a little bit of a controversial band in one sense. A lot of people didn't feel they were very talented, but they certainly have a wonderful sense of atmosphere, a wonderful sense of I think a creative approach to sound and so on. Let's hear a bit of the opening. The opening is this extended instrumental part, and then I'm going to skip ahead to hear some of the singing. You should listen to the whole thing when you get a chance, but notice all this heavy reverb, feedback, echo effect. Now let's skip ahead a little bit to get to the vocals. Takes a while for them to come in. Here we go. Notice the delivery. Now, one thing that's very typical of the Gothic style are these extended tunes. This is a 9.5 minute song, and it got this extended atmospheric feel to it. So it's really building the sound environment rather than just sort of getting to the point and getting out. Here's one of the great bands of this period and of this style of music, of Gothic rock. This is Joy Division. They started in 1976, consisting of Ian Curtis on vocals, Bernard Sumner guitar and keyboard, Peter Hook bass, and Stephen Morris drums. They're considered one of the pioneers of post-punk in general. The album Unknown Pleasures in 1979, and that's the cover you see, that very famous cover that's a sound wave that's being depicted there. This was their first and their breakthrough album. Martin Harnett produced it and included several intriguing production elements, including a Leslie cabinet, which is a cabinet where the speaker revolves within the cabinet. Digital delays, tape echo, Marshall time modulators, and this gives the album a very characteristic sound. And when you hear it, if you know the album, you can hear whatever track on it, and even before you recognize it as such, you know what it is. It has a very distinctive sound. Their second album, Closer, in 1980, and the non-album single, Love Will Tear Us Apart, those were both released in 1980, and this was immediately followed by Curtis's suicide. Ian Curtis suffered from epilepsy and from depression. He was very interested in existentialism and in nihilism, wondering whether or not there are any values to life. He was suffering from a pretty traumatic marriage at this point. His relationship with his wife had deteriorated. She was filing for divorce. He went to his house and tried to persuade her not to divorce him, and then asked to be left alone before he had to catch a train to get ready for tour. And when she returned to the house, he was hanging in their kitchen. He had hanged himself. So this is a fellow who is very not only interested artistically in the issue of depression, but was suffering very deeply from depression. Let's take a look at one of their songs. This is the song Disorder, and you'll see that it refers both to the disorder of depression and the disorder of epilepsy. If you listen carefully, you can you can see how he's alluding to these issues in the lyrics. But also notice how the lyrics work here. I've been waiting for a guide to come and take me by the hand. Could these sensations make me feel the pleasures of a normal man? This notion that he's alienated from the day-to-day life that other people enjoy and take for granted. Let's hear a bit of this. Notice the heavy use of synthesizers. This is a very influential sound for the early 80s. So first bass and guitar. This kind of clangorous sound. Notice the delivery of the vocals. This kind of droning approach, same note. You can hear the keyboards in the background a bit here. Notice the guitar part, these bends that feel almost out of rhythm. Notice how high the bass is at times. So you have this kind of meandering sound to it. The guitar sometimes feels like it's almost out of time, and yet at the same time, there's something very melodic. It's very catchy. The guitar part's more melodic in many ways than the actual vocal part. The vocal part's more or less a drone, right? So you have these elements of that relate to new wave, and yet it's clearly not quite new wave music. It's catchy in some ways, but it feels alienating and alienated at the same time. And notice this, I've got the spirit but lose the feeling, right? That becomes a refrain in this song. The Cure are a great example of Gothic rock. They were signed to Polydor through Chris Perry. Their first single, Killing an Arab, was based on Camus, the great existentialist novelist. You can hear that song on the Spotify playlist. And it stirred both controversy and popularity. Then they put out 3 classic Gothic albums, their second album through their fourth. So this would be 17 Seconds from 1980, Faith from 81, and the, I think, truly amazing album, Pornography from 82. Although Pornography received pretty bad reviews at the time, which we'll talk about in a second. These albums are dark and deeply tormented. Pornography in particular depicts the lead singer, Robert Smith's struggles with depression and suicidal thoughts. He said in an interview that he either was going to commit suicide or he was going to purge those feelings through an album, and that's what he feels that he did. The NME, the famous British music magazine reviewer Dave Hill quipped that the album was Phil Spector in hell, and you'll hear all the reverb in a moment. The band was in disarray after that album, and Perry, the more or less their manager, suggested that they reinvent themselves. And at this point, the band was really just Smith and Lawrence Tolhurst, who was the drummer but then becomes the keyboardist. And as we'll see in a second, they released the song "Let's Go to Bed," more or less as a jokey pop song in answer to Perry's suggestion, but it winds up doing pretty well. And so then they write other pop-driven hits like "The Walk" and "Love Cats," and then they have several successful albums after that with a somewhat more hopeful quasi-psychedelic vibe, but mixed in, as we'll see, with some Gothic elements. So there's "The Head on the Door" from 1985, which has "In Between Days," which we'll listen to a bit. This introduced them to a larger U.S. audience. And then their popularity really reaches a peak with "Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me" from 87, with the song "Just Like Heaven," and then "Disintegration" with the songs "Fascination Street" and "Pictures of You." Here's the band, and you can see Robert Smith in the center there, and you can see part of that, the pale face. Sometimes he wears much heavier mascara than he has on here, and the crazy dark hair, right? There's the beginning in some ways of that emo look. It's not quite the emo look yet, but that's where we're heading. This is the Gothic look that preceded that. And to the left, you can see the album Pornography. Let's hear a bit of the song The Hanging Garden from that album. Let's look at the lyrics as well. Here they are. And here's the song. Again, toms, no cymbals, right? No rides. In this case, very little snare even, just a lot of toms. That bass. And the guitar is playing this kind of meandering line again, which is quoting the vocal melody that will come soon. Drony vocals. Again, that meandering guitar part, just like we saw in Joy Division. There's all these effects. It makes the whole thing sound kind of far away, like it's coming from a distant place. Notice, at times, Robert Smith doesn't worry about rhyming. Those lines don't really fit together in any poetic sense, as far as scansion goes. So again, all this reverb, all this kind of distance feels like they're screaming to you from some distant place. The drony vocals, all of this is characteristic of Gothic rock. Now they take a turn, as I said, with the song "Let's Go to Bed." Let's hear a little bit of it. It's a very different vibe. More synthesizers, and that poppy do-do-do-do bit. Do-do-do-do. Notice even the percussion has a poppier aspect with the clap sound. The kind of strange lyrics, I'm shaking like milk. Again, not very concerned with rhyme. So notice there are certain very poppy elements, the do-do-do-do's, for instance, a very clear structure to the song, less of the drony vocals, right? There's some of that still going on, but less of it. You still have some of the strange lines, right? Look as perfect as cats, and he likes the image of the cat. He uses it in several songs. The I'm shaking like milk, these sort of strange, surrealist images. You also have the kind of doubting about love here, right? That it's just the same as a stupid game, and yet I don't care if you don't. Let's do it anyway. So it's not quite the level of depression that we saw before, and yet there's still this underlying melancholy that's at play here. Here's the album cover for Head on the Door from 1985, which features the song In Between Days, and we'll listen to that in just a second. And here's the album cover for Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me from 1987 with the song Just Like Heaven. Another really great song from The Cure, and one that you should listen to for this week. Here's In Between Days, the lyrics of the opening. Let's hear a little bit of it. Like a lot of those songs, it begins with this instrumental synth and guitar and bass, setting out the melody. Some of their intros, none of them are particularly virtuosic. Some of them go on quite a long time, though, setting up this atmosphere. So that continues even into their poppier phase. The synth takes over. And there's a nice element of orchestration to this song. I think this is an interesting song, kind of like the Smiths song, right? There's something very upbeat about the music, and yet notice the opening of the lyrics. Yesterday I got so cold, so old, I felt like I could die. No, that should have been so cold. Yesterday I got so cold, I felt like I could die. Yesterday I got so old, it made me want to cry, right? So there's this obvious element of depression in the lyrics, and yet if you just listen to it on the radio and don't pay attention, you might never notice. The Cult's another good example of Gothic rock, much heavier of a rock band in some ways. They have two albums that I would consider essential: Love from 1985, which features their breakout hits Love Removal Machine and Firewoman, and then Electric from 87, which has the amazing song She Sells Sanctuary, and then Rain. Let's hear just a little bit of Love Removal Machine to get a sense of the heavier aspect of Gothic rock. Notice, unlike the other Gothic rock groups we were talking about, this one has plenty of hi-hat, right? So not just tom work. Sort of classic guitar riff. And then you're not going to hear the drony vocals with this singer. This is one of the great rock singers of the early 80s, or mid-80s. But again, Love Removal Machine, right? And you can read the lyrics and see what you think they're all about. It's somewhat ambiguous, but anyway. Now, alongside this is a movement in Britain called New Romanticism. This emerges mostly from London nightclubs like Billy's and the Blitz in the late 70s, early 80s, with an emphasis on fashion, much more than on the, not Gothic fashion, but this sort of elaborate androgynous fashion, somewhat coming out of a David Bowie influence, as we'll see in a moment. So extravagant, idiosyncratic costumes, and a big thing at both Billy's and the Blitz was wearing these elaborate costumes and trying to outdo each other. And elaborate makeup is a kind of ironic return to the 18th century, right? So if you've ever heard the song Rock Me Amadeus and saw the video for it, Falco is a good example of what I'm talking about here as far as the look. The central boutiques for this fashion trend were Kahn and Bell in Birmingham, and then PX in London. The fashion designer Vivienne Westwood, who was partnered with Malcolm McLaren, if you remember from the punk scene. Vivienne Westwood released her Pirate collection, and this was promoted by Bow Wow Wow, the band, and Adam and the Ants, and we'll take a look at some of the Pirate collection in a moment. And both of them were managed by, not surprisingly, Malcolm McLaren, who, was, as I said, was partnered with Westwood. There were several acts that emerged out of this scene. There was Visage, which you don't hear as much about anymore, Culture Club, a hugely important act, as we'll see in a moment, Spandau Ballet, and several others. Meanwhile, in Birmingham, and remember, Birmingham's where Black Sabbath was from, and so on, there's a new band emerging named Duran Duran, and they're beginning to gain traction. So the early terms for this, and they were thought of as part of the New Romantic movement as well. So the early terms for this movement were the Blitz Kids because of the club, the New Dandies because of the outfits and so on, and the Romantic Rebels, or simply the New Romanticism, which is what we call it by today. Here you can see Vivienne Westwood's pirate collection, and you can see some women over to the left, even with the hats. You have a little more of a subtle version right next to that. You can see a boot beneath, and then four other people in the sort of festooned pants, and then there's Adam Ant, who is something of a fashion icon at the time. We were talking about earlier today, we were talking about the idea of Reaganomics and neoliberalism and the economic ideology of neoliberalism. Part of that, one of the main streams of that in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s was Thatcherism. And here you have Margaret Thatcher. And some bands associated with the style of New Romanticism didn't want anything to do with that term. But many people, critics, began to see these bands, even the ones that didn't want anything to do with the term, as being emblematic of the kind of escapism and focus on fashion and on the commodity that was associated with Thatcherism. Whether that's fair or not to Margaret Thatcher, I'll leave for you to decide. She wasn't really someone who emphasized fashion in any strict sense. I mean, she didn't um, attempt to glorify fashion, but this idea of a culture that is driven by production, that is driven by conspicuous consumption, that is part of what Thatcher was promoting, that people should be self-reliant and should be interested in the exhibition of their wealth. And some people associated this style of music, the New Romantics, with that element of Thatcherism. So the influences, David Bowie is of course a big influence with his extravagant costumes and personae, his androgyny, the eclecticism with respect to fashion, what he calls his grab bag approach to fashion. Then there's also Roxy music, right? This Brian Ferry is the lead singer and songwriter, Graham Simpson on bass, Brian Eno on synthesizer. This was an art school band. Let's hear just a little bit of one of their songs. This is their most famous, More Than This. You can hear the synth sounds, the kind of spacey sounds. And then that kind of relaxed approach to the singing and so on, that's also influential on New Romanticism. There's also, of course, the emphasis of the keyboard in the electronic music world, especially Krautrock, which is what they called the German electronic musicians. The most famous being Kraftwerk, with their tune Autobahn, which was an 11 UK hit in 1975. Let's hear just a bit of it. And you can see them in the middle there, where they're dressed up more or less like robots, playing their synthesizers, and then behind them is a projection of them on the screen. So the synthesized voice saying Autobahn. And let's move into the tune a little further. So all these synthesized sounds. We'll see that this was a huge influence on techno as well, as I imagine you can already hear for yourself. And then a more proximate influence was, of course, Gary Newman, who was in the post-punk band Tubeway Army, but begins experimenting with very simple synth lines. He never really learned to play piano in any strong sense. He was a guitarist, and he plays these very simple lines and creates an album called The Pleasure Principle in '79, where he's playing only playing synth, and that has the hit Cars. Here you can see him again with the heavy mascara, the sort of robotic look. And let's hear just a little bit of Cars. So all that synth sound. Notice even the singing is meant to be robotic, right? And so he's really drawing on Kraftwerk and all of that electronic music, and yet making something very poppy, very catchy, very accessible. And this song had a huge influence on British bands in the early '80s. One of those bands would be Flock of Seagulls, who had their very famous tune "I Ran So Far Away." Notice the crazy haircut with the singer. This was a huge hit on MTV. It was part of the second British invasion. And it may have been, it looks like, it was probably the first single to chart in the US at least, primarily because of its promotion on MTV. Let's hear a little bit of it. Notice, unlike Gothic rock, you have much more of the hi-hat sound. The drums almost are borrowed a little bit from disco, not quite. And then the synth and guitar combination that we've been hearing over and over again. Now, of course, one of the most famous of these groups of the New Romantics was the Culture Club, and certainly one that had the greatest impact. They were led by vocalist Boy George, who had a very androgynous fashion sense, very heavy makeup, often looked and dressed like he might be a woman. They formed in 1981 in London. They had very eclectic musical influences, including new wave, American soul, reggae, calypso, salsa, and even country music. And they had two unsuccessful singles, but after that they released "Do You Really Want to Hurt Me," which became a number one UK and a number two pop here in the US in 1982. And it's a reggae tinged tune. It kind of has a nice subtle approach to its reggae influence, and therefore it's in line with a lot of post punk at the time. And yet it's sung in the manner of a torch song, almost like something by Billie Holiday or something. So they're mixing these genres of on the one hand, post punk and reggae, and then the torch song tradition. The video, which I'd like you to look at for this week, featured blackface. It wasn't nearly as controversial then as it probably should have been, or certainly would have been today. But you'll see he's drawing on just a whole bunch of different references in this video, and it has a little element of time travel to it as well. So take a look at it. Their debut album, Kissing to Be Clever, also featured the song "I'll Tumble For You," which was the number 9 pop hit. And then their follow up, Color by Numbers, was another number one UK and number 2 pop in '83 and featured the famous song Karma Chameleon, which is also on your listen list. Here you can see Boy George and the band. Boy George is the one in the hat up front with the heavy makeup. And then here the opening of the lyrics to "Do You Really Want to Hurt Me?" So let's take a listen to it. So notice the gospel influence in the opening with the synth, but also the ooze in the voices. And then it kicks into the reggae beat. Notice the sort of torch song singing approach. So notice also that's a step too far, right? Precious people always tell him, right? So again, pointing out his difference from other people. These are very typical 1980s post-punk and new romantic kind of lyrics. Another huge band of this period, and more or less in the style, was Duran Duran. They're one of the most successful acts of the 1980s. Their use of dance beats combined with the synthesizer created very catchy, very accessible sound that was produced by many post-punk bands. They're one of the first bands to shoot their videos in 35 millimeter, therefore making the colors pop, making them much more vibrant and the visuals look more polished. So take a look at, for instance, their video for Rio, I believe is one of the ones I put on there. I also put on the video for Girls on Film. They took MTV very seriously as a major outlet for promotion, and they used professional film directors. Along with Michael Jackson, they were one of the first to use professional film directors for their shoots in order to get the best possible videos out of this. Their first album, Duran Duran, was number 3 UK, and it was released on EMI, the same as the Beatles, in 1981. And that included the hit Girls on Film, and that had a highly erotic video. The video was actually designed, it has depictions of topless women wrestling and various sexual fetishes. It was actually designed not to be shown on MTV because it was created before MTV. It was designed to be shown in clubs and to play on the Playboy channel. A carefully edited version did show up on MTV and was quite popular, but wasn't nearly as risque. Here they are. They eventually become known as the Fab Five, just like the Beatles were known as the Fab Four. Let's hear a little bit of Girls on Film. Notice the photography sounds. Notice the harmonies and the vocals. Also, the double tracking of the main singer. That's a very typical 80s sound. And that particular kind of double tracking that kind of flattens out any kind of pitch differentiation and so on. And we'll hear different kinds of double tracking as we go through the 80s, 90s, and so on. But that's a very 80s ish sound. Here you have Rio, probably one of their biggest albums, although it's only number 2 UK and 6 US. It still is the album that really left a huge impact on just everything. It sold a lot. Part of what kept it out of, I forget what kept it out of the higher spot. That was 82 was a pretty big year for pop music, and so obviously there were 5 other albums that kept it from getting higher than number 6 in the U.S. But it really makes their reputation with songs like "Hungry Like the Wolf" and "Rio," and you'll look at the video for Rio. In June of '82, they appeared on the dance TV show Dancing on Air, and their fame just exploded. And this is when they become compared to the Beatles, so they become the Fab Five. And it was very typical, for instance, when I was growing up, that girls would have posters of them in their rooms and so on. Now, related to all this is synth pop, right? It's the characteristics of synth pop. There's a decent amount of overlap here with the New Romantics, but with even more emphasis on the synthesizer, a cooler, less emotional, quasi-mechanized rhythmic sound. This is starting really with British bands, many of which formed part of the Second British Invasion, and other European bands. This is also, we're talking about early 80s, so this is when MIDI was developed, the musical instrument digital interface, as a communications protocol and digital interface between electronic musical instruments and computers. And this was first discussed in October of 1981 in a paper published by Dave Smith and Chet Wood of Sequential Circuits. It was standardized, MIDI was standardized in 1983, and this means that a single controller, like a keyboard for instance, but also later a mouse, could produce sounds from different electronic instruments. So briefly put, this took that huge room-sized computer synthesizer Tonto that Stevie Wonder was using in the 70s, and it reduces it to a single keyboard in a desktop computer with maybe some effects units. So this makes it relatively simple to create a wide array of interesting sounds, and many bands took advantage of that, obviously. One of the ones that had a huge hit with synth pop would have been this group, Aha. So from 81 to 85, the synth pop music dominates the charts with a wide range of bands, including some that we'll look at today: Depeche Mode, Tears for Fears, The Eurythmics, Human League, Yaz, and then Erasure later on. The sound became even more accessible and popular from 84 to 85 with bands like the Thompson Twins and the Norwegian group Aha with their song Take On Me. Let's hear just the opening of that. Classic 80s synth sound there. A little bit of a funk influence. And then we'll hear the main line. And then this voice that comes in that's very along the line of the New Romantics, the vocal delivery. So it's a very soaring approach to the vocals with this element of synth pop. We'll hear something rather different with the next example. And that would be New Order. New Order formed out of the remains of Joy Division after Ian Curtis committed suicide, with Julian Gilbert on keyboards. So the remaining members of Joy Division with Gillian Gilbert. They combine electronica with dance music, so they're heavily influenced by krautrock and so on, to create this distanced, reserved sound that was incredibly influential. And one of their early hits is Blue Monday from 1983. It was the top-selling 12-inch single of all time. Not that there aren't a ton of 12-inch singles, obviously, but there are enough that that's a fairly impressive record. And they're an example of the post-disco club music known as high energy and composed using binary code on a sequencer. So they're not just playing the keyboards; they're composing using binary code for some of the parts here. They were the biggest band on Factory Records and more or less the house band at the Hacienda, which was the Manchester nightclub owned by Factory Records. Let's hear just a little bit of that song Blue Monday. And here you have much more of a removed, distanced sound. But Take On Me by Aha is a warm, romantic song. This is quite different. The synth sound creeps in. Notice again, we have this gradual building up of the texture. They're not in any hurry to get to the singing. This isn't a pop song in the traditional sense of you have to get to the chorus within the first 40 seconds, right? We're already a minute into the song and we haven't heard the voice at all. That's kind of a cool moment, right? Notice how these instruments, they link up, and at first that almost sounded like a disturbance on the sound rather than something that goes with what's underlying it. Still no lead vocal, right? We're almost 2 minutes in. The texture keeps building. I'll leave the rest for you to hear. One of the most important figures in all of this, in the synth pop sound, is Vince Clarke. He's the keyboardist and composer, and he's a major figure in the style, a founding member of three of the most important groups in the style. Depeche Mode, he was on their first album and wrote almost the entirety of it. That album was called Speak and Spell from 1981. He was in the group Yazoo, also known as Yaz, a duo with Alison Moyet, who added a bluesy, soulful voice to Clarke's synthesizer. They had hits with songs like Situation and Only You from 1982. And then he was in Erasure with Andy Bell and had hits with songs like A Little Respect and Chains of Love in 1988. So throughout the 80s, he's in three of the most important groups. Here he is with Alison Moyet. And let's hear just a little bit of Situation. Again, that classic synth sound. Again, building up the texture. Now let's get in a bit because I do want you to hear her singing a bit. So this becomes a new way of doing this stuff. Instead of the more reserved, almost robotic sound of, say, Gary Newman or Blue Monday by New Order, what we're now moving toward is a more soulful voice above that robotic sound of the synths. And that becomes a very popular way of going about this music. We see it also in the group Erasure. Also with Clarke, but now with Andy Bell. Let's hear just a little bit of A Little Respect. So again, this more soulful sound. That soaring vocal line. So there we had 44 seconds, and we did get into the chorus, right? So now we're moving closer toward the mainstream of pop with a song like that. Depeche Mode, after Clarke's departure, the band sound becomes darker and borrowing a bit from industrial music, which we'll talk about more at the end of today's lecture. Big songs from them, People Are People, that was a number 4 UK hit in '84. It addresses racism, becomes an anthem for the LGBTQ community. It employs tape loops in somewhat complex fashion. Let's hear just a little bit of that. So these samples. So again, this very robotic sound, these interesting use of layered samples. And then later songs like Blasphemous Rumors and Personal Jesus build on this. Let's take a look at Blasphemous Rumors for a second. Here's some lyrics. Let's take a look at these lyrics. Girl is 16, whole life ahead of her, slashed her wrists. Again, we're dealing with depression. We're dealing with these extreme emotional situations. Bored with life, didn't succeed, thank the Lord for small mercies, right? So a bit of irony there, a little bit of more than irony, sarcasm. Fighting back the tears, mother reads the note again. 16 candles burn in her mind. She takes the blame, it's always tame. She goes down on her knees and pray. I don't want to start any blasphemous rumors, but I think that God's got a sixth sense of humor, right? And when I die, I expect to see him laughing. This very cynical, very dark tune. Here's a bit of it. So these loops again, the synth loops. That bit of noise and the heaviness there, drawing from industrial music, as we'll talk about in a moment. And here you will have a little bit more of the robotic delivery of the lyrics. Let's get ahead to the lyrics. Very atmospheric, very dark, and I think very moving. So again, we might ask ourselves, why do we want to listen to a music about a girl's suicide, to a piece of music about a girl's suicide? Why do we want to involve ourselves in this kind of emotional space? And this is something we'll discuss on Tuesday. This was their big album, Violator, 1990. Stripped down, sinister sounds, included songs like Personal Jesus, Enjoy the Silence, and Policy of Truth. Another important band of this style and of this era, Tears for Fears, based around the duo Roland Orzabal and Kurt Smith. They were part of the MTV-fueled second British invasion, and it was their song Mad World that got people's attention and gained them worldwide recognition. Then their second album, Songs from the Big Chair of '85, really established them as a major act with songs like Shout and Everybody Wants to Rule the World. Let's take a listen to a little bit of Mad World, not much of it, but a bit. You have the opening and the lyrics. So again, this synth sound, the loops. All the drones. So this sense of anomie, the sense that the normal ways of living don't satisfy us anymore, that we don't fit in the world. The best dreams that I have are the ones when I'm dying, right? This sense of alienation, very typical of this form of music, or these styles, all of these styles that we're talking about today. Here's the album Songs from the Big Chair. Now let's turn our attention elsewhere. Let's look at industrial music. And we're going to see that some of the same harshness and some of the same depression applies here. Industrial music, the emphasis is on the industrial sounds. Now, we've already heard some of that, especially in Depeche Mode. So sounds that, and it mixes elements of rock and electronic music. The elements, along with elements of musique concrète, so a real concentration on electronic sounds. Again, we already saw this in Depeche Mode. They were very influenced by industrial music. And then also drawing on elements of punk and no wave and noise rock. So there are elements of the avant-garde, classical music like John Cage, and then also Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, but also popular avant-garde music like Can and Kraftwerk and Frank Zappa. The term derives from industrial records, which was established in 1976, and that's definitely a quiz-type question. So industrial records established in 1976 by the group Throbbing Gristle, which is one of the most important of the early industrial music groups. The music often features loud, harsh, dissonant sounds, many of which derive from pre-recorded noises, grating synth sounds, and heavy distortion. So this is a self-conscious art music. It's not meant to appeal to popular taste, and it's meant to, in some ways, alienate. A pioneering group within the styles, of course, Throbbing Gristle. They were formed in 1975, and as we saw, they had their own record company, Industrial Records. This features Genesis Porridge, Cozy Fanny Tutti, Peter Sleazy Christopherson and Chris Carter, and they developed out of an experimental performance art group, Coum Transmissions, or COUM Transmissions. They created an aesthetics of confrontation, employing visual imagery steeped in Nazi symbols, photographs of concentration camps, and pornography. And Cozy appeared in many pornographic photographs. She often appeared naked and sometimes in lewd poses and so on. They're deeply influenced by the beat writer William Burroughs, who experimented with drugs and wrote a lot of his stuff while high on heroin. And then they're also deeply influenced by John Cage and this idea of trying to tap into the unconscious in various ways, trying to allow music to just happen rather than consciously control it. Their songs are often collages of noise and recorded sounds. Here you can see one of the posters with Cozy fan tutte on it. This is from one of their early performances. This one's from 1976, but they did this for about a year. This whole bit. Let's hear a little bit from a few things. Here's a song called "Maggot Death Part 1." Let's hear a bit of it. Notice all the noise. These grating industrial sounds of machinery in motion. The same vocal phrase over and over again. Now they're saying maggot death, and more noise coming in. It's moved halfway through the song. See, it's the same feel, but now with even more noise piled onto it. Here's a picture of the band, and let's hear a little bit from the album that we're going to look at the next slide, but I want to hear just a little bit of two different tunes. Let's start with Hot on Heels of Love. This is an album from 1979 called 20 Jazz Funk Greats. We'll look at the cover at the next slide. Now this fits a little more with the kind of stuff we were already hearing. It's a little less aggressive. Let's move it roughly halfway through. Now we have a few more somewhat annoying noises that are part of the production. Here we have the album cover, 20 Jazz Funk Greats. Obviously, that's irony. None of this is jazz funk or sounds anything like it. Let's hear a little bit of the title track, 20 Jazz Funk Greats. And again, let's move in a bit. And this 1979 album is one of their most successful. It's one of their most accessible. As we saw with the last song with Maggot Death, that was quite confrontational, and this is a little more appealing in a traditional way. The next group crossed over a little more into the mainstream, And that is this one, Cabaret Voltaire. They were formed in 1973 in Sheffield, England. They're much less confrontational than Throbbing Gristle. And they moved through the 1980s. They incorporate more dance elements, but still retain some of the harsh sounds and the experimentalism of industrial music. One of their, I think, great albums is this one, Three Mantras from 1980. Even though it says three mantras, there are only two tracks, Western Mantra and Eastern Mantra, but it's really just one long but divided track on either side of the album. There's also on the packaging an apology for them leaving off one of the mantras, and they say that they've reduced the price accordingly. Again, obviously a joke. Here's a little bit of Western Mantra. Let's go into the track a little deeper. You see how it's developing. Notice the loops. Some of those loops feel a little awkward the way that they repeat. Feels just a little off kilter. Their album Covenant, Sword, and the Arm and the Lord from '85. This was more abrasive and anti-commercial. Virgin really threatened them that they must produce a hit single, and so they released the song "I Want You," and you can see there's a video for it, and you should watch it for this week. And this is a song about masturbation. Several of the other songs contain bits of speeches by Charles Manson. This was meant to be a confrontational album. It was meant to be off-putting in various ways. Let's hear a little bit of that song of "I Want You." I want you. Again, there's the off-kilter elements. So freak yourself and close the door, right? Obviously not what the record company was expecting. And yet it did moderately well, not terribly well. I mean, this is the era of Michael Jackson and Prince and Madonna and Peter Gabriel and some of these huge pop hits, and this is clearly the outlier, or one of the many outliers. In fact, most of what we were listening to today, some songs that we heard today were very popular, and yet all of this is a little to the side of the things that we were talking about for the last session. So what I want you to think about this week, and for this session rather, is this issue of this music that somehow stands apart from the rest, that builds on more negative emotion, at least at times, that's concerned with depression, that's concerned with feeling out of place in a world that insists on feeling in place, right? I mean, that's part of the 80s is this idea of we all belong through our purchasing power, and yet there's an element here of these commodities that are speaking to a lack of fit, a lack of belonging. That's it for this session. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks.